Hi, Life Group leaders. Today we start our new unit in Romans. And sometimes, as a Life Group leader, you're asking yourself, how am I going to discuss this passage for 20 or 30 minutes? Well, with Romans, I suspect that you're going to have the opposite problem. This is a very dense book. But remember, your job as a group leader isn't to cover everything in the passage. It's to spend time, get to know your group, and then spend time in prayer and ask God, what is the one thing my group needs to hear this week to bring that up in discussion so that that truth can saturate their heart and lead to life change. Before we jump straight into chapter 1, I want to give you a little bit of introductory material and some important background information. Romans is really the only part of Scripture where there is a very detailed and systematic presentation of Christian doctrine. It's often called the largest book of the Bible, and certainly not by length, but from importance and in the genius of its presentation. And what I mean by that is that Romans has been responsible for great movements in the history of the church. Augustine, Luther, Wesley, they all had moments of inspired life change while studying Romans. New Testament scholar F.F. Bruce said this: "There's no saying what may happen when people begin to study the letter to the Romans. What happened to Augustine, Luther, Wesley, and others launched great spiritual movements which have left their mark in world history. But similar things have happened, much more frequently, to very ordinary men and women as the words of this letter came home to them with power. So, let those who have read thus far be prepared for the consequences of reading farther. You have been warned." I think that's a great tongue-in-cheek cautionary tale about the life-changing power that can be found in this book. These great movements have been a result of a new and refreshing understanding of grace, which is really the theme of Romans. How do we think about God, and what do we believe? And I'm going to pause here and just give us some fun trivia facts about Romans. It has over 7,000 words, and so it's the longest of Paul's epistles. Paul quoted more often from the Old Testament in this letter than he did in all of his other letters combined. Romans has 61 direct quotes and many more allusions to the Old Testament. And he pulls these quotes from at least 14 different books, though Isaiah and Psalms are the most frequently cited. And Paul is going to show us in Romans that every nook and cranny of the gospel has been proclaimed by the Old Testament prophetic writings long before he took the job as being an apostle of Christ. Now, in your class, you may or may not want to cover the historic context with your life group, but I will do so just briefly right here. While this book reads more like an essay compared to some of Paul's other letters, and that's mostly because Paul had never met anyone at the church in Rome before, it's still a letter addressed to people. And because he had never met these people before, he covers Christianity from A to Z. It probably contains all this doctrine because the church in Rome was seated at the heart of the empire. And because of that, it had a greater ability to impact the rest of the world. The only source that we have, though, about the church is this letter. There's not any evidence that any of the apostles ever visited Rome before this letter was written. And therefore, we have to conclude that this church was started by those who became Christians elsewhere and migrated to Rome. At the point of the writing, which is the late 50s AD, the church had a major presence in the city, but it was not a large church, but actually a collection of smaller house churches. But it was well known. It was probably comprised of mostly Gentile with a few Jews mixed in. Rome was the capital of the largest empire in the world. It was important as a center in the biblical world as well. At this time, about 1 million people lived there, including many slaves. It had great architecture, but it was also home to many slums where the poorest of society lived. It would be very much like a cosmopolitan city today as far as its diverse population. And because it was a center of world commerce, people would travel there for business from thousands of miles away. It had an elite society of wealthy and a very large group of poor people. Romans gave the world some innovations like architecture and government and military, but they were also very immoral and violent. Because of all these factors, it would have been natural for some Christians to migrate there for business and then add to the church. Christianity was several centuries away from being a state-sanctioned religion. It was considered to be wacky but harmless by most Romans. But not many years later, as Christianity continued to grow, it became more of a threat. Nero would begin persecuting Christians in the area, so the saints in the city faced much of the same types of temptations and issues that we face in large cities today. In our passage today, Paul answers the question, why would he write to a group of people that he didn't know? But there's also something else that plays to part of it. The content of the gospel message had been attacked by the Jews in Rome, and we know this is an issue because we have the Edict of Claudius. In 49 AD, Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome because they were constantly rioting at the instigation of Christus, or Christ. And so Jews were causing all sorts of riots because of the Christians in the city, and the emperor just said, just kick them all out. And because of this, Paul was unable to travel to Rome even though he wanted to. Because at the time, remember, Christianity wasn't a separate thing, it was just considered a subsect of Judaism. This is a letter of introduction for Paul to gain the trust of the Roman church and to help the church know the gospel. He wanted to make sure that they had sound teaching. And to conclude the overview, Romans answers the most important spiritual questions in an approachable and understandable way. It answers questions like, how can I, a sinful person, be accepted by a just God in a way that does not compromise his justice? How does this acceptance affect my relationship with the law of God? And how could Jesus be the Messiah if his own people rejected him? Well, now let's just get into our reading today. We read chapter 1, 1 through 7, and then 13 through 17. We are essentially reading the introduction to Paul's letter. In this first section, Paul mentions every topic that he's going to discuss in reverse order. Paul begins with a very broad perspective. It looks at the promise of a Savior in the Old Testament. It reviews Paul's ministry up to this point, and it surveys the religious history of the Gentile world. The salutation, which is the longest one that Paul ever wrote, identifies the writer, it introduces the subject of the letter, and it greets the original readers. This first sentence implicitly sets forth the most fundamental facts of Christianity. In particular, it shows that the main facts of the gospel fulfill Old Testament predictions. The central idea of the passage is that the whole epistle, that the gospel as preached by Paul to the Gentiles, was not inconsistent with, but the fulfillment of, God's promises to Israel. So we'll just start in verse 1. In all his letters, Paul used his Roman rather than his Jewish name Saul, and probably because he was known as the apostle to the Gentiles. And even though he had not visited Rome, he would know that his readers would know him by reputation alone. So he just had to give his name to identify himself. And after doing so, Paul gives the scope of his calling, which is to proclaim the good news of God. As a previous Pharisee, Paul had lived a life set apart to observing the Mosaic law, honoring Jewish customs, but now his calling was to proclaim the gospel. In verses 2, we see the promise of the Old Testament scripture. Paul began to exalt the gospel that God had called him to proclaim. It was the message that God had promised, not just prophesied, in the Old Testament scriptures. Paul did not preach an unanticipated gospel, but one that God had promised through his prophets. And this was the reason Paul appealed to the Old Testament so often in this and all of his other letters. Moving on, verse 3 and 4, Paul identified the gospel's theme, that it centers on his Son, Jesus Christ, who was both human and divine. He identifies that the Messiah will be human, but also divine, and that says that the Old Testament not only predicted that, but also predicted that the Messiah would be born in the same town as David. In verse 4, we see the Old Testament also predicted that Jesus would suffer and die. Verse 5 encapsulates this idea that Jesus was descended from David, plus his resurrection from death, proved that he was the same Messiah and Lord as promised in the Old Testament. And therefore, the gospel that Paul preached as an apostle could be to all people, the Gentiles, not just to the Jews, through faith in him. And then 6 and 7, Paul reassures his readers, the majority of whom were Gentiles, that they were a part of the intent of the gospel. And then the section that we skip, verses 8 through 13, In this section, Paul says that he prays often for the Roman Christians after hearing of their faith, and that he had also planned to visit them. And the reason why he wanted to visit them was for fellowship, to encourage each other and encourage each other's faith, and for, as he says, sharing of things profitable. The edict that we referred to earlier was probably the biggest reason why Paul could not visit Rome until now. And the reason why he says until now is because, like I said, he probably didn't write this till the late 50s, and the edict of Claudius was revoked in October of 54. So time would have passed and the word would have spread that it's now okay for Jews to re-enter Rome. In 14 and 15, we see Paul's love for Christian fellowship and his obligation to preach the gospel to all people motivated him to visit Rome. And having received the grace of God himself, he recognized that this placed him in debt to everyone else. He owed them the opportunity to hear the gospel and to receive God's grace themselves. Every Christian, then, is indebted to every non-Christian because they possess and can share what can give life to those who are dead in sin, the gospel. And when he uses the words Greek and barbarian, he's distinguishing Gentiles by language and culture. In Paul's day, this was the standard way of describing all of the races and classes within the Gentile world. Greeks spoke of anyone who did not speak the Greek language as barbarian. Essentially, the word means non-Greek speaker. And Paul didn't regard his opportunity to preach the gospel as a burden that he had to bear or as a duty that he had to fulfill. Rather, he was eager to share the good news with everyone. And that brings us to our theme of what he's really getting at, not just for our reading today, but for the entire book in 16 and 17. These two verses conclude the introduction and transition into the body of the letter. They summarize Paul's theology as a whole. In verse 16, Paul's basic attitude to the gospel comes out. Not only did he feel obligated to proclaim it and eager to proclaim it, but he also felt unashamed to do so. The reason for Paul's confidence was that the gospel message had tremendous power. But the gospel doesn't announce that everyone is safe because of what Jesus has done. That's universalism. Because what he says is the gospel is available to everyone who believes. And believe what? Well, believe the good news. What's the good news? It's the news that Jesus is the Messiah who God promised to send, and that he has done everything necessary to save us. Note that Paul mentions no other conditions besides believing the good news in this crucial verse. He said nothing about having to do anything in addition, such as undergoing baptism, or joining a church, or making a commitment pledge. The issue is believing the good news and trusting Christ. Either a person does or does not do so. And then he uses this phrase, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. It's a curious phrase, and I have a feeling that over the next few weeks I'm going to repeat this a lot. I don't have time to explore the subtleties of this phrase for our brief video, but I will direct you to a link that John Piper has an excellent overview of how Jews have and how they don't have priority of the gospel over the Gentiles. I'll just summarize it by saying that the Jews are first because God chose them to carry the message of salvation, and Jesus was a part of them and then ministered to them first. But they don't have priority over the righteousness the gospel provides, over merit or how they are saved. God blesses Jew and Gentile alike. Finally, verse 17. Paul explained what he meant when he said that when a person believes the gospel, he or she is saved. What makes the gospel powerful is its content. The salvation that God has provided and offers is in keeping with his righteous character. So what did Paul mean by the righteousness of God? It could be a moral attribute of God, like his faithfulness, or it could be a legal status that God gives his people, or it could be both of these things. Or it could be an activity of God, like specifically his saving action. But what I think that for Paul, the righteousness of God is a relational concept, bringing together the aspects of activity and status. We can define it as the act by which God brings his people into right relationship with himself. Here we have the summary statement. First, the word the gospel, which is so dear to Paul, will appear, and next is the saving power of this gospel is proclaimed, and then the secret of the gospel's power, the revelation of God's righteousness, on the principles of faith. As Paul says, the righteous shall live by faith. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that Paul doesn't address any moral issues in the imperial capital. Rome had plenty of issues: slavery, lust, vice, economic injustice, a society built and bred on warmongering and violence. Paul didn't think that social reform was an evangelical imperative. The proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ solved society's problems, and an individual's problems in particular. And that is still true for us today. The church will transform society on the same level that we advance the gospel. And as we end, you can see the three big talking points of this passage. One, the gospel is the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes. The gospel is for all people. Two, it's accomplished from start to finish through faith. And three, it was predicted beforehand in the Old Testament and confirmed through the resurrection of Jesus. As always, I'm going to give you a few discussion questions to talk about with your class. But this week and many of the weeks that follow, there's going to be a systematic presentation of the gospel. We're going to be talking about the gospel. Maybe you want to give your life group a chance to respond to the gospel. Maybe you just want to ask the question, have they received the salvation of God that only comes through faith in Jesus Christ? Do they know that they've done that? Could they say without a doubt that they left your class on Sunday morning and that they would, when they died, that they would go to heaven? Be one of those opportunities to bring it up. Just because somebody's a regular doesn't mean that they know Christ. Maybe you want to save that for another week. I've got our usual battery of questions along the lines of what are we trying to do in life group that we're trying to help people belong, believe, and become, so that they can have a community of people that will help them become a fully formed follower of Christ. So belong questions. Do you read or watch the news? If so, how often? If not, why not? Is most of the news that you hear each week, whether that's online through TV or social media, is it good or bad? Believe question. In Romans 1:17 contains a number of words that are important for Christians, like gospel, salvation, and righteousness. How are these words related to one another in Romans chapter 1? Based on Paul's use of these three words in this passage, how would you explain each term? And finally, our become questions. If someone was ashamed of the gospel, what signs might there be of this? Why was Paul not ashamed? Is this a good reason enough for you to be bold today? It's going to be great. It starts off with a bang and it's just going to go up from here. I just pray for you that you figure out that one thing that you need to talk about in class. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. I want to do everything I can to help equip you to be the best life group leader that you can. Love you guys, and I'm praying for you. Godspeed.